What's up, everyone? Alex here. So I wasn't planning on being on camera today, and I saw this news article about how the PlayStation 5 Pro has been announced. That whole 9-minute talk with Mark Cerny, which is a great dude, and promising ray tracing, high resolution graphics, frame rates up to 60 frames per second, more GPU, advanced ray tracing, and all this junk. And I can't help but think that we have heard this before, not just from Sony, but also from Microsoft. And I'm tired of it. And I am sorry for basically saying this and framing it this way, because I know that many of you know me as a happy guy who would love to find like the joy in games and why other people like certain games, but certain people can't. And that's been my goal for this channel this whole time. But I just can't just stand and abide by the fact that every single new console generation, we're being promised new consoles that are more powerful, but they never, ever give us what we wanted. Now, I want to be clear and step back a little bit by saying that I hold no allegiance to any sort of console manufacturer whatsoever. I am not a Sony fanboy. I am not a Microsoft fanboy, PC fanboy, Nintendo fanboy, whatever. My loyalty is to the games that are released on their platform. And I am more curious about how games perform on said platforms and how they play and how it attracts different sorts of people. Because to me, gaming is all about the people. That being said, I also want to bring your attention to the sheer fact that there has not been, since the 32-bit / 64-bit era of gaming, a single platform that is super duper powerful that has basically been the go-to platform for that generation, or rather the most popular platform of that generation, which of course won the majority of the market. Like, think about the 32-bit and 64-bit era. Like, Nintendo had the more powerful hardware, but Sony's 32-bit system is actually more popular. And think of it this way as well. Sure, like the 64 did not have the disk drive, which probably would have helped it, become more popular. But there was also the Sega Saturn, which actually had an expandable RAM in Japan only, but like it technically was more powerful than the PlayStation because it could render 2D sprites a lot better. But again, the PlayStation 1 did far better because of the 3D, but it's still not as powerful as the 64. Then you go to something like the next generation, the PS2, the Dreamcast, the Xbox, and the Nintendo GameCube. And out of all four of those, arguably, like the Dreamcast, the GameCube, and the Xbox, the original one, are more powerful than the PS2. But the PS2 was the more powerful piece of hardware. Then you go to the next generation with a PS3. So you got the PS3, the Nintendo Wii, and of course the Xbox 360, which personally is my favorite Xbox of all time. And while some will say that, oh, well, it's Xbox, you're partially right, except for the fact that Nintendo basically overtook everybody with the Wii. You can say all you want about the games on the Wii, like some of them are shovelware or whatever, but the sheer fact that there were more Wiis sold than any of those two consoles says a lot about, this whole power versus, like adoption kind of thing, right? Then you get to the PS4 era. And this is quite interesting because, like, I feel like this is a generation where this idea kind of fell apart a little bit, because technically the PS4 was more powerful than the Xbox One, if only because of the fact that like the Xbox One also tried to pivot towards like a really weird direction. And we all know what happened with the Wii U. It's like, they tried something. It was more like a stopgap to the Switch, but it is what it is. It's that. And then you get to this generation, the PS5 with the Series X and S and the Switch. And, like we're seeing a lot of people really loving the Switch, so much, and I'm not saying that like Sony doesn't have the majority of the share market for, especially for AAA games. Like they definitely do. I think if there were two consoles that you probably should have right now, it probably would be a PS5 and a Switch and then a PC to play like Game Pass games. I think that's very reasonable. But that being said, like I can't really even say that the PS5 specifically, excuse me, is dominating the numbers game, right? That would be the Switch, a much cheaper piece of hardware that, a lot of people have. Like we literally have like two of them in our household. In fact, like there's something that I noticed in our household that's very fascinating, which is we actually double down, sometimes triple down on a platform if it's the most popular one. Right? So we have two Switches, for example. My wife has an OLED. I have like a launch one. And as far as the previous generation goes, we have like two base PS4s and then a PS4 Pro. I can tell you the story some other time, but that's not important. But given that short history lesson, we've seen that like if you look at the games for the most popular platforms, generally speaking, there's some, that are really good ones that came out and some really like interesting ones, but there are different approaches to each console that are either caused by the marketing or the games that have come out on it. And for the Wii, which is such a really interesting project, like, experiment, if you will. I think one of the things about that was so weird is that like it did popularize waggle gaming, as we all called it at the time. And we probably still do. And there were a mix of really good games, and then there's a mix of like bad games. And this brings us to today, because I think that with the announcement of the PS5 Pro being more popular within this generation, right? I have to ask the question of how we actually justified the PS5 like right now, thinking about it. And I think for some of us, a lot of us will say yes, because we played a lot of really good games on that platform. But for the rest of us who are fans of this channel, who play JRPGs, we have never really found a reason or a good enough reason to upgrade to the PS5, let alone a PS5 Pro. Because if you really think about it, like a lot of those games come out on either PC, which a lot of us have, or the previous gen, which is the PS4, or the Switch, if you consider that previous gen. So what's the point apart from higher performance? And that's why I want to bring this up again to the whole performance conversation, because again, this is also a really big thing whenever a new console comes out. And again, like I want to also compare this to the mobile industry with like the iPhone and the Android and stuff, where the upgrades are so, I don't know, like small that it's people are kind of struggling to figure out like what new features to get people to pay $800, $900 for a new phone. And the console industry wants to adopt to this model where it's a constant upgrade path, and kind of do away with the console generations. And I think that the PS5 Pro is Sony's answer to that question of like, how can we get to that point? But I also want to remind people that like back when the PS5 was announced, there was the promise of no loading times. There was the promise of ray tracing, which, to be fair, it does exist. But then frame rate is becoming a much bigger part of the conversation when it comes to gaming, because, like people's tastes change, and that actually becomes like a really important part of it. And I bring this up because this idea that there is not going to be any loading times, or you're going to have ray tracing with like 60 frames per second, and all these promises that people do, whether it's the PS5 Pro or any console talked about in the future, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that when the first 1 or 2 years using this native hardware comes out, sure, it'll use exactly everything and fulfill every promise that these developers and console makers have pretty much said. But as the hardware gets older, ambitions grow. People will want to push hardware to their limits. And then we start seeing more 30 frames per second games with even better ray tracing and all this stuff. Now, I know what you're thinking, especially if you're in the PC space. Well, how about, these upscaling technologies with AI and stuff like that? Well, as if you're like me and you watch Digital Foundry, those technologies are still imperfect. And even then, there is post-processing that needs to happen that kind of slows the processing between what happens in your finger when you press a button and what actually is seen on screen, because all of those things need to be created and post-processed. That's why they call it that. And so I'm not saying that it's going to be impossible, but I'm just saying to everybody who's watching this, please temper your expectations of what games are capable of within the next several years. Because as game development is going to get just even more expensive with more powerful hardware like this, there's going to be a need for developers and publishers to scale down the looks of their games to the point where realism is going to essentially kill AAA games. And I know that sounds really ridiculous, and honestly, I don't like saying that. But we're at year 4 or 5 that it takes to make games, which is really ridiculous. When this generation started, I was literally like just turned 40. And now that I am 45 years old, like, I still sometimes question why I have the PS5. And think about it this way, right? If there's anything that the Elden Ring DLC has reminded me, is that one of the most popular games in this generation does not perform well on any other platform except the PS5, with a caveat. And this is something that you can check out Digital Foundry for. The best way to play Elden Ring right now, and this includes PC, is installing the PS4 build on the PS5 and playing it there. I'm not kidding. You should try it, because I tried installing that game, the PS5 native app for that, and it still performed the same way as it did several years ago. And to that point, I also want to say that, like, technology is nothing without the imagination of creators, whether it's, a creator like myself or anybody else. I think that creators just encompass everybody who makes something, right? And I think that as this new generation is looming, I think we need to kind of bring it back to the games first and foremost, and not focus so much on this performance thing, because while performance is super important and graphics fidelity is super important, we are forgetting the fact that, like, our first, one of the biggest reasons why we love this hobby is because we love playing games, and we want to play more games, not less. And I don't know the solution to this, because again, games are just getting more expensive to make. But if there's any one lesson as a consumer that I would like you, and I'll even count myself here, to be aware of, sorry about that, is the fact that technology isn't everything. It's the games, stupid. All right. I know that sounds like a really weird way to, like, end this, but I want to hear what you think. I'm not even going to tease, like, the next videos and stuff on my channel. If you like my rant, subscribe to the channel, youtube.com/@ backlog battle. I want to hear what you think. All right. Take care, everyone. I'm going to go back and take a nap. Bye.